Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Creating Connections, a New Way Forward. My name is Tracy Duncan and I'm excited to be hosting and moderating this session with you all today. On behalf of the amazing team at FearLess, I would like to thank you for joining us. For those that may not know, a quick introduction to FearLess, PTSD Australia and New Zealand. We're a registered national charity working with people living with the consequences of post-traumatic stress, often referred to as PTSD. We also help family members in any way affected by it. People who engage with FearLess come from all walks of life, including those living with PTSD and their families, or people who want to do their bit to make the lives of people living with PTSD more enjoyable and fulfilling. Our work complements the activities of other community-based organisations and government agencies that provide services to people with PTSD. For today's webinar, I'm pleased to announce our speakers, FearLess Chairman Chris Barrie and CEO Alex Gerrick. Chris and Alex will discuss the importance of creating connections as well as our priorities forward here at FearLess for those living with PTSD. This is especially important not only after the impact of the bushfires, which affected so many, but also those living with PTSD during and after COVID-19. Before I hand over to the two lovely gentlemen, I'd just like to mention that we welcome any questions you may have during today's presentation. Please feel free to comment throughout and we'll answer your questions at the end of the session. If we don't get to you today, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Lastly, we'd also like to encourage you to continue following FearLess on our social network channels for future updates on events. We sure have a lot planned. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over and welcome Chris and Alex. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy. It's a great pleasure to be able to conduct this webinar because if you think back over the last 3 months, our world has undergone unprecedented change. And whilst after the national conversation last year, we had all sorts of plans about how to continue conversations and things we might do in 2020, our world has been turned upside down over the last 3 months. None of this was unexpected, I have to say, but there's no doubt that nearly everybody was surprised and we were caught out. Our leaders certainly were not prepared. And now, of course, we have some lessons to be learned. And I look forward to seeing how now we're going to deal with climate change, because I think this is going to be in the spotlight of the future. But as I think back over the long hot summer that began in September of 2019, so new slide, please, Tracy. The first thing to say about it is, new slide, please, Tracy. At the end of a long drought, and people may remember the Millennium Drought, our country was dry. It was after 2 long droughts, and who can be surprised about the bushfires that we experienced. And for me, being on the telephone talking to people who were in trouble, having to put up with the smoke, and on my part, fortunately not having to deal with the fire itself, it was certainly horrifying. Our news stories were full of flame, full of people going through terrible experiences, and one could only but wonder what effects it's going to have. It's been called the Black Summer, and by some estimates, 80% of Australians have been affected by loss, by the fires, and by smoke. And some of them will live with the trauma of this summer for many years to come. And at FearLess, that means we'll be adding numbers to the cohort of our community we intend to look after. Our response to support people affected by bushfires has also been lacking. If you live in New South Wales, you know that just this week, container housing, 180 of them, were delivered to people whose homes had been lost in the bushfires. And you'd only wonder what that must have been like, living without your home, either in a shelter or a shed or a caravan or with relatives for the last, let's say, up to 5 months or so. And of course, now we have a Royal Commission that's being established to look into all of it. Next slide. So what does the bushfire, the black summer of bushfires mean for people with post-traumatic stress? Well, if we hark back to the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, subsequent research shows that more than a quarter of those who were in high impact areas ended up with long-term post-traumatic stress disorder that affected their mental health quite seriously. It's on the record that most of those people needed significant professional help to deal with their PTSD. It's impactful. And as people are having to deal with the aftermath of the bushfires, we can think about them coping with loss. By loss, sometimes family members. Certainly a lot of homes were lost, properties destroyed, and that means putting our lives back together is made a lot more difficult. There are people in the immediate aftermath of the bushfires who were very brave and trying to be in control. They wanted to be in control, many of them said, because they were grateful they still had their lives, the lives of their loved ones. But after a short period of time, the impact of the loss really does affect them terrifically. And so they end up, even now and into the future, trying to rebuild their lives. But the important point is that going through all of this trauma, we become much more dependent on other people to help us. And I don't know about you, but from where I saw things, there are a lot of good stories about Australians helping each other, quite often people they didn't know, which sort of made you feel rather proud of the way that when push comes to shove, there was a basic resilience in our community that we often do not see. Next slide, please. So putting now the bushfires behind us, and between the bushfires and the events of the last couple of months, there were some floods. And those floods, of course, for many people brought the drought to an end. But it also affected them when floodwater invaded their homes. But if that wasn't enough, now we're involved with a virulent pandemic, we call it COVID-19, which is making its way around the globe, affecting communities in all sorts of different ways. We know that the pandemics do inflict long-lasting emotional trauma and post-traumatic stress on many people. And it's true that PTSD will affect a lot of people who will work in our healthcare systems, whether they be doctors who may have to make some tough decisions, or whether they'll be health support people who are looking after people in hospitals and in our surgeries and other places on home call visits. And of course, all of these healthcare workers will be more exposed to the virus than nearly every other person in the community. The second thing about the pandemic is that it has a global reach. It's not just our community, it's not just our state in Australia. And if you looked at the world record, you find all sorts of performance measures. Some are good, not very many of them are good, in fact, and some of them are very awful. Australia seems to be doing reasonably well after a shaky start. But it's also the suddenness of this pandemic and its health effects, which have produced massive unemployment, and loss of jobs itself can create post-traumatic stress for some people, and the uncertainty that it produces in very many people. I'm sure you're all aware of the conversation starting to take place now about when do we get out of lockdowns and when can we get back to life as normal. But I put it to you that we won't be going back to the lives we left in January of this year. We'll be going back to a very different set of circumstances and one for which there is a lot of certainty to play out. But it means there won't be an instant bounce back. And that, of course, of itself fuels anxiety, panic, and even some fear in people. Everybody is at risk, and I've talked about the healthcare workers already. But I think as we look for each other, it's important to find people to talk to about your own thoughts and emotions. Next slide, please. So, putting together what it means now to be in lockdown and dealing with self-isolation and loss, I guess the most important thing is to think about how we combat loneliness. In the last 3 weeks, I've participated in 5 webinars going all around the globe, talking about mental health in various cities and countries, and this theme of how people deal with the anxieties and the anguish of their loneliness comes through all the time. The advice as a low common denominator seems to be do things to deal with your loneliness by firstly having a routine. Get up at the right time every morning. Don't linger in your bed. Make yourself get dressed. Dress up for the day. Don't wander around in trackies until it's time to go to bed that night. Establish a routine and stick to it. It's nice to count off the days of the week and to preserve your weekends for weekend relaxation and to try to find things to do at a working pace on weekdays. Find special rewards for yourself. I'm not sure about you, but there are little things that you can do in your life that sort of give you a feeling of comfort, of pleasure. Little things that may not mean a lot, may not be all that hard to do, but it's important to factor them in and make them part of your life during this period. And of course, don't forget about the other people in your lives. Think about having Zoom meetings with your relatives, just to chew the fat. Talk about the things that are worrying you and finding out what might be worrying them. Finding out how the state of health is. Working out what we're going to do when all this gets over. Thinking about the future is always helpful. And finally, of course, talk, talk, talk. One of the best recipes for dealing with post-traumatic stress and loneliness is finding people to talk to who can help you. In that way, you're not alone and you'll be able to unshoulder the burden onto some other people. So, what should we do? Take the lockdown seriously. It does have a big impact. The record of success in Australia tells exactly that story. And recognise the potential consequences for everybody's mental health. Next slide, please. Finally, for my part, I just want to talk about something we discussed during the national conversation last year. And those of you that are tuned in now may remember Belinda Neal's presentation in which he talked about how to manage your post-traumatic stress and what I call the Belinda Neal toolbox. And as I have reconstructed the toolbox, only to offer the headings that Belinda used, I recall a very important point that she made was that the toolbox is there to be used when and where you need it. It's not for 1 minute saying that you have to do everything or use every tool in the box every day. It is saying that there are a whole range of things that you can do to support yourself in difficult circumstances. And so let's just go through the points that are in the Belinda Neal toolbox. The first point is an acceptance of the situation in which you find yourself. It's not really a good thing to pretend that you're not in some sort of anxious state or worried about something or fearsome about what you've been through and not being able to accept it. So acceptance is a really important condition. And while it can take time for people to get to that point, it's something that needs to be worked on. The second point was to talk to someone. We said last year that finding a trusted GP would be a terrific place to start and to open up to that person as you seek support and help. But it doesn't have to be a GP, and frankly, in the lockdown state, it's getting hard to see a GP face to face. But find someone you can talk to and build yourself a safe environment in which you can talk freely. The third point was not to underestimate the importance of physical activity. Activities such as exercise, gardening. Gardening can be a terrific thing to do, and some of us haven't been out in our gardens for a long time and are finding it quite therapeutic. And even walking the dog or going for a walk yourself can make a big difference. The fourth point on Belinda's list, and I think a really valid one for now, is being able to take time out. If you're living with a family, have a process by which you can declare time out and go on and look after yourself. And encourage other members of the family to take time out if they need it as well. The fifth point was to think about yoga and other exercise regimes that are not quite so tough as circuits or high intensity interval training, and something that you can look forward to and is enjoyable. And of course, flowing from yoga, there would be mindfulness meditation, and there are apps you can find for your phone, such as Headspace, which can encourage you to take meditation and lead you on a pathway through different meditation regimes. Diet plays a big role too in managing post-traumatic stress, and so eating well should not be underestimated. It's observable that when you look around now in the print media and in other places, streaming videos, there's quite a lot of work going in promoting the idea of eating well. And as you probably know, a lot of restaurants in Australia are now doing takeaway meals rather than serving meals in restaurants that are now closed. And finally, in the self-help regime, relaxation exercises. I think breathing was a big one that Belinda talked about. Having a regime where you can take deep breaths and steady yourself if you feel that things might be starting to get out of control. And finally on her list was medication, prescribed medication, such as antidepressants, but not alcohol. And of course, as we said in the national conversation, and we would say now, if you can move to a regime where you can use all the other tools in the toolbox in preference, that is a better state of play to be in. I'd now like to hand over to Alex, our Chief Executive Officer, to talk about our webinars and our plans for the way ahead. Alex.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's great to have you, and I hope everyone's keeping well and safe. The first thing I want to say is, as Chris was speaking, he said something about in this times of self-isolation to try to pretend that you're actually at work or doing something professional by doing the part, by getting dressed, etc. I found that over the last couple of weeks, as I've been stuck at home, you tend to let yourself go a little bit. I had a very bad attempt at growing a beard for a couple of weeks there, which went astray, walking around in my jeans and t-shirts for a couple of weeks. And today, with the webinar being on tonight, probably for the first time, I actually ironed some clothes and put some proper clothes. And Chris was exactly right. I feel an invigorated and different person as a result. So there's a lot in that. Look, I want to start off by saying that just to echo Chris's comments, that the world has indeed obviously changed quite dramatically over the last couple of weeks. If I think back to about 4 weeks ago, probably 4 weeks ago, I attended the launch of our good friend Kerry Atherton's new book, In the Sunshine Coast, on a Thursday night, travelled down to Wollongong the next morning to meet up with some of our FearLess colleagues in Wollongong, along with Tiffany Bauer from Nectar, to talk about possible venues for next year's our next national conversation scheduled for next year. Little did I think any of us know during the course of that day that events were going to spiral with respect to COVID-19, in particular how that impacted on us Australians. Tiffany and I were in Sydney Airport that afternoon. I was talking to her about my imminent plans to travel to the UK in a few days' time, and then we heard basically the news while we were in Virgin Lounge that the nation was basically going to be locked down as of over the weekend. So that's how things quickly moved. And I think talking to a lot of professional people, those ex-colleagues of mine in the public service and other people that I know across Australia, I don't think anyone was prepared for what occurred, particularly over that weekend, and the realisation that not only their own lives would be changed, but many people that they knew, their lives would be changed as well. Friends, family members, and so on. I've got two elder siblings in their 70s who are very, very fit people, but they have been obviously quite scared about what's been happening over across the world within their age group. And so everything about their life and their existence has changed as well. So we are living through a period of incredible change. And as Chris said, I think we're on a pathway where that change is going to continue until we see until maybe a vaccine is found or a cure is delivered for us. One of the things that struck me the most when I first joined FearLess as the CEO was I came from obviously a military background and a defence background. In my previous role in the Department of Veterans Affairs, we were very focused on PTSD with respect to veterans. And when I came on board with FearLess, it was a real desire of mine to ensure that the organisation followed through with from many of the policies that we spoke about in previous years about opening up the information that PTSD impacts on everyone. It doesn't. We obviously are very conscious of how it impacts on our military personnel and our first responders. But as we've seen over the last couple of months, it also impacts on people who are at the front line fighting our bushfires, and obviously at the moment on the front line fighting those who are fighting this pandemic in our hospitals and so forth. So the whole barrel of people who PTSD can impact is growing by the day. And I want to also echo the concerns that have been raised by a number of experts around the potential for PTSD to occur in individual homes due to things such as domestic violence and sexual abuse. So we really are living in an era now where no one will be untouched by PTSD. So we need to ensure as FearLess that we partake in delivering as much information as possible about the impacts of PTSD, particularly towards specific employment groups. So I'll talk a little bit about what we propose for next year in a moment, but our webinar series was always something that I wanted to do this year, given what I've just said about the diverse views of PTSD and how it impacts widely across our society. So what we intend to do, particularly now, given that we are hamstrung by COVID-19 in terms of delivering more one-on-one seminars, we intend to initiate a webinar series that looks at a whole range of issues relating to PTSD and how their impact on different employment categories and different people. So we intend to probably run one every 6 weeks. Today obviously was our first one to set the scene for the rest of the year. But our intention obviously is to try to get across as many webinars as we can during the course of the year. We've got an exciting array of potential speakers to select from. We are, as a board, will have a look at some of the topics and some of the speakers that we can access over the next 9 to 12 months of our series, and hopefully these will be informative opportunities for people to learn more about PTSD and issues that are appropriate within people who are working in particular areas and exposed to trauma. So that's what we intend to do. We will obviously want to hear from you as well. So any feedback about topics that you would like to hear us talk more about, please let us know through our various social media channels or drop us an email, because this is not only about what we think, what you may wish to hear. We want to hear from you as well about what you think the key issues and the key topics are. Next slide, thanks, Tracy. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're working on at the moment, particularly given where we came from last year's national conversation. You'll recall, for those who attended the national conversation, there were a number of outcomes that were outlined in our communique. Probably the most important one that we focused on was developing a management protocol. This protocol would basically set out key information about PTSD that could be accessed nationally by anyone who wants to access it. It would focus on a number of sub-levels about what PTSD is about, who it impacts, what are some of the things that you can do to help manage your PTSD, and also some connections that you can make with other organisations that might help you. Now, we think the protocol is long overdue, but we also think that it's important to get the protocol right. There's no point having information that can be accessed, which is not clinically tested or clinically supported, I should say, which is not supported by the key organisations that deal with PTSD across Australia, and it's not supported by people who are working in the field every day. So we need to get the information right. We need to have a single source of truth for many of the topics that we want to include in that protocol. And that's what I've been working on, and the team at FearLess have been working on over the last few months. What I'm doing at the moment is putting together a draft structure on what a protocol might look like. I'm also trying to establish the key components of the protocol. For example, we talked a lot about at the national conversation last year about diet and about exercise and about other things that people might do to help them alleviate their trauma-related illness. So what I'm doing is categorising those key issues and looking at who are the key sources of truth that can back that information up. If we're going to list that information nationally, then obviously we need to have the experts providing that information. So that will mean over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, creating dialogue with our key partners, people that we need to speak about who are experts in a particular field, and get a cooperative and coordinated effort in developing a protocol that's not only informative, not only correct, but it can be consistently maintained and updated. So that's the challenge for the next 6 to 12 months. Unfortunately, I had a whole list of people to go and visit before COVID-19 became an issue. So that's going to be my biggest challenge, is how we connect with people. As we've seen tonight through this wonderful webinar, there are different ways now that we're able to connect with people. So that will be something that we'll continue to do over the next few months. But it's really important, I think, that a protocol can be supported, particularly by organisations who deal constantly with their people who are impacted by PTSD. And just very quickly, I've had a number of conversations very recently with veterans some veterans about their particular issues. Now, without wishing to go too much into the process that veterans go through when they put in a claim through the system for their PTSD-related illness, sometimes people are waiting a long time for a number of different reasons. They have to produce medical documents, they have to go through a bureaucratic process to get their claim approved. And for a long period, for many of them, they are waiting up to 6 to 9 months in some instances before they do get their claim approved. What we think that the benefit of a protocol will be for people in those situations is that it gives them further information about PTSD, gives them scope to have a look at different ways that they may be able to self-manage their condition in consultation with their medical expert or their doctor or the mental health practitioner. And so this information, we believe, is not always available at the moment to people who want to know more about PTSD and its impact. So that's where we think a protocol in particular will be very decisive. And so we're very conscious of the importance of this work, and we want to get that right. So that's the process that we have in mind for the next 6 to 12 months. Next slide, please, Tracy. Quite frankly, we were very, very excited after last year, after the success of last year's national conversation, about doing some more activities this year. What we had in mind initially was to do probably 2 or 3 one-day seminars for 2020, focusing on a number of issues that emanated from our national conversation. Obviously, that's not going to happen now given the advent of COVID-19, but we do have a plan moving forward, and I think it's going to be an exciting plan as well. Obviously, a lot of that's contingent upon how we as a nation get through the next 3 to 6 months and where we come out at the end of that tunnel. For instance, the whole issues around travel, whole issues around movement between states, all those things are still factors that we don't know about at this stage. But obviously, by the end of the year, I would expect that we would have a better knowledge about what will be happening with respect to those issues. But what we want to do is to plan and move forward on that we did deliver at the last national conversation. We're going to have our next one in August of next year, or we're planning to have our next one in August of next year. This will be in the south coast of New South Wales in Wollongong. We've chosen Wollongong because we always said that our second national conversation would be regionally based. And what we think Wollongong, for a number of reasons, suits that requirement very well. We're already, as I said before, starting to have initial discussions with the local community about having that event down there. What we also want to do, we've got that planned for the 17th and 18th of August next year. What we also want to do at the conclusion of that event is to have a summit in Canberra the following day on the 19th of August. We'd like to bring together a lot of people within the policy and decision-making sectors of the public service in particular, bring them together, particularly those who work in a mental health field or a PTSD field, to talk about some of the outcomes that we discussed over the previous 2 days and look at how we can influence the policy debate on PTSD as we move forward. So that will be hopefully a well-attended event by people who are working in that field in Canberra. So that's what we have in mind for our national conversation next year. I hasten to add that a lot of this, obviously, as I said before, is dependent upon what happens as we come out of the COVID-19 tunnel. The other thing that came up at our national conversation last year was this idea about a community-based model for PTSD. That was looking at how at a community level people can mobilise the resources of the community to battle PTSD and its consequences at a local level. Now, given that we held our last conversation on the Sunshine Coast, we were hoping to do that this year, to have a roundtable with a number of key people who are involved in mental health on the Sunshine Coast, to talk about how we could possibly use Sunshine Coast as a model for how we could, a model that we could possibly develop further at a more national basis. So we still intend to do that next year. At this stage, we're looking at the 4th of March to be able to hold that event, and that's also contingent upon conversations with the Sunshine Coast Council, Queensland Government, and a range of other people. And again, at this stage, these are only early days in our planning for that particular event. So that's something else that we have in mind for next year. So in summary, we're still on track at this stage to deliver a national conversation next year, a summit in Canberra that follows immediately from that national conversation, and also a day event on the Sunshine Coast to talk about our community-based model for PTSD. And hopefully, as I said, we will be in a position to be able to provide more information on those events as the year unfolds. The other thing I just want to say really quickly as well, that again, one of the key outcomes from last year's national conversation was this need to connect people who are involved in PTSD more efficiently. And we see ourselves in FearLess as an enabler for that. I have spent, and Chris and other members of the board have spent considerable time introducing different people to other people so they can make those connections. I think it's very important that that we do that, continue to do that, and I will certainly be very involved in ensuring that these connections can continue, because as we saw last year, fighting PTSD has to be done on a coordinated basis and a coordinated level. There's so many people who are doing fantastic work, but are doing it in an isolated way. So one of the things that we want to help is bring people together so that we can have a nationally consistent way of doing things, and that will be something that I will be continuing to do during the course of the year. On that theme, I'm very pleased to announce tonight that that I've been accepted onto the board of Animal Therapies Limited, who are the national organisation that oversees animal assisted therapy in Australia. I think it's important that people I connect with organisations such as Animal Therapies Limited to help promote some of the excellent work that they are doing with respect of treating PTSD through animal assistance therapy. So I'm very happy to be involved with them and look forward to working with their board in the future as we try to further enhance their work. So that's probably all I want to say at this point. I want to thank everyone again for their support to FearLess over the last year in particular. One of the things that we will continue to do, and our wonderful support person Tracy has done a fantastic job on this, is to keep our presence open on social media. We are getting a lot of great feedback from our social media platforms. We'll continue as much as we can to promote the work that we are doing in FearLess through those platforms and provide as much information as possible about what we might be doing moving forward. So thank you for listening for me tonight, and I think I'm handing back to Chris.
Thanks, Alex. I should just finish up by saying, before we go to questions and answers, please stay in touch. As Alex has said, we know that talking to each other can help an enormous amount, and we have made a priority of facilitating those kinds of connections, and again, to reflect on our experience in August last year, having the opportunity to talk to each other, to hear the stories, to provide support and help when needed, and also to get it when needed, I think makes a huge difference. And I think when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder in our community, especially for people who are not veterans, we need to be fearless in going forward. So I think we're over for questions and answers now, please, Tracy.
Yes, thank you, Chris and Alex. So we'll take a few minutes now to answer some of your questions. I'm just getting them open now. So we've got one from Barrie. He says, I think it is critical to deal with PTSD. However, the transitional process is both complex, multi-layered and challenging. Simple symptomology consistent with this may to some extent replicate PTSD, but that need not necessarily be accurate. I reframe this process as PMTC, and I draw on operational terminology to reframe and guide individuals through this territory. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll start. Look, I think the first thing is to reflect on something that David Forbes once said to me, David being the director of Phoenix, Australia. One of the difficult things for bureaucracies to understand about post-traumatic stress is that it varies depending on the individual experience actually, and the trauma itself. And it also varies from being the consequence of a single traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. And that's actually an important perspective, because under the old system, when people told their stories of their mental anguish, the people who were hearing those stories often sat in judgment and said, no, that's rubbish, you know, it doesn't mean anything. Well, you know, to be honest, that's not actually the important piece. The important piece is that somebody is suffering anguish because of a trauma that they have experienced. The second thing to say about it is we know that the modern technology can diagnose post-traumatic stress to a very, very high level of certainty using imaging techniques. And while I'm not for one moment advocating that everybody with post-traumatic stress gets an image to find out whether they got it or not, I think in the really hard cases, getting an image can be vital to understanding the best way to go about relieving the post-traumatic stress in that individual. And so this is a very complicated area, and it is quite right to say the symptoms aren't always straightforward. They vary according to the individuals. The diagnosis varies according to the individuals. But at the end of the day, helping each other, whether health professionals helping clients or whether people are talking to each other and providing help, is essentially what it's about. And it's a very human activity, because post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder was not invented in the last decade or so. It's been around for a very, very long time.
Yeah, can I also, I can also,
no problem.
Yeah, Barry, I think that's a really good point that you raise. Look, I've said for some time that the transition process is critical to, and we're talking about transition here in the ADF from military to civilian life. I believe that transition process is critical to ensuring the good mental health of our veterans when they leave the Defence Force. One of the key issues there, I guess, is ensuring that when people do leave the military, that all the things that they need to do are able to be done quickly, so that they're not standing around after they've left the ADF for a long period of time trying to figure out how they should be supported. And that process, I know, is being worked at between both Defence and DVA at the moment. But the other aspect around transition, which I find quite disturbing as well, is the impact that it has, particularly on those people who are forced to leave the ADF because of injury or illness. ADF has been their career for most of their life, and all of a sudden they are thrown out into a new world which they're not prepared for. And this obviously adds to the stress, the anxiety that they feel. So getting transition right, I think, is integral to helping and supporting veterans and their mental health. One of the things that I would hope that we can do as a community is to provide different ways of how we can, or different options that we can perhaps provide to Defence and DVA on how that process can be improved. Now, as I said, both organisations are very determined to improve that process, but I still think there's a long way to go.
Thanks, Alex and Chris. Mike says, carrying on the conversation is important, and asking what's worrying you is a great question, Chris Barrie. I'm hosting a weekly coffee catch-up Zoom meeting for former AFP members, and was wondering what are some other questions that I can ask to help our members with their mental health?
Mike, they're very good questions. What's worrying me is that I think the community is a bit divided. When I hear people talk about getting out of lockdown and getting back to life, I think, that's terrific, provided you don't catch the disease. All the data I'm collecting about performance overseas suggests that once you go for a solution that looks like a herd solution, in other words, get everybody infected and then move on, you can't go back. You can't go back once you let it go like that. So I like to think that at the moment we lock down, we manage our COVID so that we don't overwhelm the health system, so that those people who really do need ICU treatments can get it, and we get better outcomes for everybody. But on the other hand, we can't go on sitting in our homes and twiddling our thumbs forever and a day either. And we will need to get out sometime. It might not be in the next few weeks, but certainly it's going to be, I hope, before the end of the year, and do something meaningful with our lives by the nature of work. But I also think there are going to be a lot of people who won't be able to work for all sorts of reasons. And as I said in the opening part of this webinar, people who lose their jobs and sometimes get post-traumatic stress disorder, and Alex referred to what happens with former ADF people who transition out and unprepared for a new world, you know, that can be just as traumatic as some of the events-based traumas that we sometimes hear about. So they're the things that worry me, and I am especially worried about the leadership, both nationally, at state and local levels, because it's highly variable at the moment. I think we've seen some very good performances, but we've also seen some otherwise. But the community needs good, strong, determined leadership now.
Thanks, Chris. Another question from Jackie. Hi, Chris and Alex. Thank you for this initiative. How far along in the process are we to move away from the term disorder to injury? The stigma is a huge battle and re-traumatizing.
Look, that is a fantastic question. I think I'm on the record as preferring injury. I think the scientific evidence clearly shows it's an injury, but every time I bring it up with the professionals, they push back and tell me, no, it is a disorder. And of course, that term is historically based. That if I had my druthers, I'd turn it around tomorrow, because it is an injury, as far as I'm aware, just like a broken leg or a broken arm.
Yeah. Thanks, Tracy. Can I just add to that?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, look, I agree with exactly what Chris has said. My experience has been that, and this again goes to my point about national coordination, is that there are different people who are working in the field who call it different things. And as a result of that, I think it does create confusion. My personal view is exactly the same as Chris's. But I think that's why we do need a national coordinated effort on post-traumatic stress, because we're getting to the point where it means different things for different people, and people use different terminology. Consistency, I think, is the best way that we can combat this, and that's something I hope that through a protocol we can promote once we get that finalised.
Thanks, Alex. Andrew says, loss of identity coming out of service is a major issue. What are you suggesting that members transition to?
It is a loss of identity, and look, in fact, that might be a really good, Andy's question might be a really good topic for another webinar, because we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But I think there's a couple of key points there. That number one, and I give this example of someone that I met when I was in DVA. He was a operator of a UAV, an unmanned air vehicle in the Middle East, a very highly skilled position. He was forced to leave the ADF as a result of the injuries that he obtained in Afghanistan. Came back to Australia and couldn't find, the only work that he could find was sweeping the floor in the hospital. Now, you take that person who has been trained to a very high degree, tell him that he can't do his job anymore, and now his future involves working in a hospital sweeping the floor, you can understand the impact that that has on his mental health and his self-esteem. So those, to me, it's really about trying to focus on how we, I think employment is a big issue, how we try to help people who leave the ADF, who've got specific skills, to help them transition to civilian work. Now, there's a lot of things and a lot of programs that we could look at to do that. The government has got a Prime Minister's Veteran Employment Scheme, which is looking at some of those things. But again, like everything, I think more work can be done. And to answer the question, what are we transitioning to? I think we are transitioning to a job that gives people self-worth, gives people self-esteem, and gives people a sense of recognition for the things that they did in the ADF and how the community now views them. But that's not only with the ADF. I could talk about the same things with respect to our first responders as well. We need to ensure that if people are being forced to leave those high intensity front end jobs, that we as the community support them when they transition out. I think that's very, very important.
Thanks, Alex. I think we'll get one last question in. It's from our friend Kerry. I'm getting increased requests for support by those battling with alcohol addiction at this time. Knowing how alcohol and substances increase DV, it is very concerning. Do you have any comments or knowledge of what extra support is out there regarding both these issues?
I wish I could say there was a simple answer to that question, but I don't think there is. And to be perfectly frank, there's been a fair bit of reading to be done in the last 3 weeks about increased alcohol sales and all the potential that has for ruining families and ruining people's lives. You know, I think it does come back in part to this idea that because we're in lockdown and we can let ourselves go, it's very easy to start drinking a lot, and then things get out of hand, both with family violence and bad behaviours and all kinds of things. But I don't know what else we can do. I mean, I read today about Alcoholics Anonymous. All the rooms are shut, so there's nowhere to go. This just makes it exceedingly difficult. For anyone who's in the situation, I go back to the point, finding someone to talk to, someone you can unburden the load with, doing something to get it off out of your own head and share it with somebody else can be a good start. You know, I just wish that sometimes we limited the sale amount of alcohol to, you know, 1 drink a day or something like that.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to do one more. It's come from an anonymous attendee. So, as a volunteer firefighter that acquired PTSD via frontline Black Saturday and other incidents, I still wonder why when recruits are trained, it is mostly about functional aspects of firefighting, and when it comes to potential mental health exposures, it is really a cursory discussion and then given a phone number to call if you need help. Better maturity is required here. How can this evolve?
Yeah, I was about to, sorry, Tracy, if I can add.
You go.
Yeah, I was just about to type them an answer when you asked the question. Look, I think that's an incredibly important point. I think it's important as we progress, particularly after the bushfires, particularly after COVID-19, organisations will need to start to talk about will need to start to develop training courses early on in someone's career to warn them about the impacts of trauma and how it might affect them during the course of their career. Now, a lot of organisations obviously haven't done that in the past for a number of different reasons. We can talk about how admitting that you have a problem in some cases has led to people's careers being impacted. We need to get past that that sentiment and talk proactively about how we can build someone's resilience to things that they might see in the future. And my view is exactly what the anonymous attendees said, is to develop programs early on in their careers to make them aware of the impacts of PTSD and trauma, and how they need to be able how they can seek help, the different avenues of support that they will have during their careers and so on. I think we've got to change the culture in organisations and change the mindset. We can't afford to be operating in the world that we're operating 10 years ago, in that if you admitted that you had an issue, it would impact on your career, so therefore you didn't say anything.
And I just add to that, I think there's a very big difference between fighting what we used to call a bushfire and dealing with something that's turned into a firestorm. And a lot of the pictures I saw over the last summer were not about the sort of bushfires that I grew up with. They were firestorms, and they are terrifying experiences. So to come back to the firefighter's perspective, the first thing is that has all got to be pre-trained for. The transition from a simple fire to something that's much more terrifying and harder to deal with. And the decisions that you need to make, because they're actually quite different, is all part of, I think, a new science that should have been developed about 15 years ago.
Great, thank you guys. I think we'll wrap it up now. It's been an insightful presentation. Thank you so much for both of your time tonight. Have you got anything further from the two of you?
Yep. If I can, as I said, we hope to have our next one in 6 weeks' time. I think she knows that she could possibly be doing it, but at this stage, we're hoping to have Kerry Atherton do our next one. I know that Kerry is on tonight, so if I've shocked you, I hope I haven't shocked you too badly. But we're hoping that that will be our next one coming up in about 6 weeks' time. But we'll obviously let people know in advance.
And I'd like to finish up by saying it's been great to watch the chat column and to realise that so many old friends from last year are chatting to each other around us and connecting up. And I think that's part of what being fearless is all about. So a great evening, all keep well, and we'll have another conversation in 6 weeks.
Yes, thank you guys. On behalf of the team of Fearless, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.